Russia's bombardment of Ukrainian cities feels all too familiar to many people in Syria. Russian forces have been carrying out attacks on Syrian towns and cities in support of President Bashar al-Assad since 2015. Now, one Syrian artist is using his work to send a message of solidarity.
Aziz Asmar wants to tell the world how Syrians have suffered. He wants to shake them up with his paintings, done on rubble in Idlib, the last stronghold of the insurgents. Idlib has repeatedly been the scene of Russian airstrikes. Now, more than anything else, Aziz wants to send a message of solidarity to the Ukrainians in faraway Europe.
We have terrible memories of Russian attacks, the destruction. That's why we sympathize with the Ukrainians. We fear the worst for their civilian population and infrastructure.
Russian fighter jets and helicopters have been attacking towns and villages since September 2015. Officially, they're fighting Islamist terrorists, but in reality, they're hitting civilians. Military expert Joris Van Bladelm says Putin has been treating Syria as an experimental laboratory.
It is part of the Russian mentality to bomb quite indiscriminately, but I've seen over the years a more sophisticated and modernization of the equipment. And actually, this is the essence of, for me, from the Syrian operation.
Putin is testing more than 200 weapon systems, precision missiles fired from ships, bunker-busting weapons, drones, and reconnaissance technology. Sites hit include power plants that supply electricity and water. Cities like Aleppo are bombed till all that is left is rubble. Then they are encircled and starved out. Cluster munitions are also used. Hundreds of clinics have been bombed, some more than once. Bakeries, markets, and food supplies are becoming scarce. Even schools have been hit. Amnesty International's Diana Seaman says these are war crimes similar to what is happening now in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, Amnesty International has documented attacks by the Russian government targeting civilian infrastructure, using cluster munition, using indiscriminate, unlawful attacks in general, which led to many civilian casualties. And we've seen that over and over again in Syria.
From Putin's point of view, his strategy in Syria has been successful. Russia has made its presence known in the Middle East. Assad is firmly back in the saddle, albeit by Russia's grace. Aziz Asmar fights against being forgotten. With his art, he hopes that the world will learn its lessons from the war in Syria.
The world watched as thousands of Syrians were killed. This should have taught them a lesson. If no one opposes these attacks, all of Europe will soon experience the same.
Somber words from faraway Syria after 11 years of war and destruction.
Let's get some more perspective on this story now. We can speak to Kristen Hellberg. She is a journalist, author, and Middle East expert, particularly focused on the war in Syria. Kristen, good to have you with us. We just heard a Syrian artist there saying the world watched as thousands of Syrians were killed, and if no one opposes these attacks, all of Europe will soon experience the same. Do you agree?
Well, one could definitely argue that if the international community had stopped Vladimir Putin from waging this kind of war against Syrian civilians, he would not feel encouraged to do the same in Ukraine yet. We had calls for no-fly zones, no bombing zones for years from Syrians based on the principle of responsibility to protect. This didn't happen. We didn't even see the kind of sanctions in place that we are seeing now. So you could argue, that if we had put sanctions like now, back in 2016, when eastern Aleppo was attacked, that this would probably discourage Vladimir Putin from the kind of war that he's waging now against Ukraine.
What do you think Russia's involvement in the war in Syria can tell us about the strategy that Putin might pursue in Ukraine? I mean, what similarities have you seen so far?
Well, first of all, there's one big difference here, because Vladimir Putin went to Syria because he was invited by President Assad to help him in his fight against opponents within the country. So his intervention in Syria is not illegal under international law, like his attack against Ukraine. But if you look at the similarities, I would see two things. First of all, the kind of war that he is waging on civilian areas, on residential areas, and the propaganda that he is using to explain this. We see the same kind of munition. We see incendiary bombs, cluster munition, vacuum bombs. They are all banned in civilian areas under the Geneva Convention, and this was being tried in Syria before, and nothing happened when Russia tried to use these things. We see this deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, namely hospitals, markets, and schools, something that seems to repeat itself in Ukraine. And then the same kind of grotesque propaganda to discredit your opponents and to justify his own actions. It's always blaming the others. In Syria, it was always the terrorists. And in the Ukraine now, it's the neo-Nazis and the nationalists. So this is actually the big two similarities that I'm seeing right now.
What about if we talk about humanitarian corridors? We know that they have failed so far in Ukraine because Russia has continued shelling, also civilian areas, as you've said. What has the experience with humanitarian corridors been in Syria?
Well, actually, let's talk a little bit about this name. A humanitarian corridor is supposed to help people. It's supposed to feed people wherever they are. But in Ukraine, like in Syria, it was about displacing people. So the strategy is to seal off an area that you want to take control of, make the situation for the people trapped inside so unbearable that they would want to leave. Through bombing, with airstrikes, the destruction of infrastructure, there will be a lack of medicine, there will be starvation. The Russian army will cut off electricity and internet from these places like Mariupol, for example. This is a place that has been encircled by now. So in the end, the people are so tired that they will give up and they will be ready to leave, and they surrender and they agree to their own expulsion. So evacuation, in this sense, it sounds like helping people, but in the end, as part of a war strategy, it's really it's a form of ethnic cleansing. In Syria, it was political cleansing because it was about the opponents of Assad that were supposed to be displaced, while in Ukraine, it's really a form of ethnic cleansing. So we should not misunderstand this word of humanitarian corridor evacuation, because it's really a form of displacement and to get people out to be able to, to control the area that he wants to really to conquer.
We'll have to leave it there. Middle East expert Kristen Hellberg, thank you.
Thank you.
Now to some other developments in the conflict. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in Estonia on day 2 of his visit to the Baltic states. The visit aims to assure the 3 NATO members of the organization's commitment to mutual defense in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On Monday, Blinken met with leaders of Lithuania and Latvia. The Japanese government has announced additional sanctions against Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. The measures include a ban on exports of oil refining equipment and asset freezes on 20 individuals. Sanctions have also been announced against Russia's ally, Belarus. And Russian President Vladimir Putin has denied reports that conscripted soldiers are being forced to fight in Ukraine, saying the army only consists of professional soldiers. Last week, Russia introduced a new law to suppress reporting about the war and describes its invasion of Ukraine as a special military option.